Dr. Dawson, if you'll retake the witness stand, you may cross-examine. The record should reflect that we are back on the record in the matter of State of Utah versus Martin MacNeill. He is present with his counsel. The state's attorneys are present. The jury is seated. Go ahead.
Dr. Dawson, the article that Mr. Perkins went over with you from the Journal of Toxicology and Clinical Toxicology.
Yes.
That was one of the articles that I brought up at the preliminary hearing, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And you were retained to be an expert witness on this case by the prosecution, correct?
Yes.
I should say by the investigators
Yes.
in the case. And that was sometime in the latter part of 2009?
Pretty close. I don't recall the exact timeline, but that's probably close enough.
And you had communications with Investigator Whitney at that
Yes.
time? And he sent you a lot of material about the case, correct?
Yes.
An investigative summary of the information that he'd investigated to that point, right?
Yes.
And the medical records of Michele MacNeill.
You know, I'd have to go back and look at that pile of information. It's spread over 4 years. It's hard for me to keep track of which one came exactly when, but if that was, I might have listed that in that disclosure to you about which ones were there.
There's a lot of information.
Yes.
And do you recall sending him an email on November 30th of 2009?
Apparently I did.
Okay. And some of the information that he'd given you was the autopsy report. You
Yes.
recall that, right?
Yes.
You may.
Showing you a copy of an email. Does that appear to be your email address?
Yes. Well, that's not current, but that was the time.
Was then.
Yeah.
That's an email that you sent to Mr. Whitney, correct?
Yes.
And would you read that email for the jury, please?
Doug, I've not forgotten you. I've been making discreet inquiries of some ME medical examiner friends seeking ideas for a way to get around the medical examiner report in this case. Pieces should fall into place soon, and then my initials.
Fair to say that you had conversations with Mr. Whitney and trying to help him get around the medical examiner report?
Well, in the context that I had already told him that with the current medical examiner, that first medical examiner's report, based on what that finding was, that there wasn't much point in going further.
And so you were trying to help him get around that as you set forth in the email, correct?
In essence, yes, I was trying to find people who had been involved in such situations before where new evidence or new information had come forward that might suggest there would be a need to revise that original report.
And to do that, you were kind of poking around with medical examiner friends of yours to get ideas to get around the report, right?
Well, ideas that would help in terms of understanding what is the procedure to get a revision, yes.
Okay. And you subsequently had an interview with Investigator Whitney and Investigator Robinson, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And that was on March 22nd of 2010?
I don't recall the day.
Approximately that time?
That's close,
right,
apparently.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
You may.
And if you'd look on page 1, lines 6 through 8, in your interview with Mr. Whitney and Robinson, you indicated that you went through the separate toxic screens and that sort of thing, and there was some information there, but not enough to really say specifically what happened, correct?
And I go on further to say, I'll tell you why.
I'll tell you why, yeah. So then down on page 1, lines 10 through 16, you say what it boils down to is unless the medical examiner can get around what the cause of death being the consequence of natural cardiovascular disease, That's a huge, in my mind, that's a huge issue to overcome, because we really don't have the toxicology specifically that says that, you know, that she was at some toxic level or she had something on board that she shouldn't have. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
And then on page 1, lines 17 to 22, you said, toxicology reports from the medical examiner's office that would suggest there are at least 4 or 5 compounds present in her blood at the time of death, but I don't believe that there's any of those that would be considered to be, quote, a lethal dosage. But certainly that the combination of those together with cardiovascular death or cardiovascular disease could contribute to something we call it's sudden death or cardiac arrest due to the prolonged QT interval. That's what you told them, right?
I believe so, yes.
And then on page 2, lines 27 to 30, you said, well, there is a spot in there that they measure the distance in milliseconds, referring to the QT interval, right? Measuring the distance in milliseconds is in relation to the QT interval, correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I don't know if this is refreshing recollection. I don't know if these are inconsistent statements.
Overruled. It's cross-examination. He may be confronted with prior statements.
And so page 2, line 27 to 30, you said, well, there is a spot in there that they measure the distance in milliseconds, and if that gets a little too long, what can happen is the heart can't recover, and it suddenly stops beating. You could be in the emergency room plugged into an EKG, and they can't save you. That's how fatal. That's how quickly you die from this. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
On page 3, line 46 to 48, you said, if I was sitting on the other side of the fence, my argument would be there's absolutely nothing there, referring to the toxicology, that wouldn't be expected to be seen in somebody who had those prescriptions. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
Page 5, line 7, you said, even the blood work that we have,
I'm sorry, which line on page 5?
line 7, I believe. Let me double check that.
Line 7?
Yes.
I don't have a line 7 on page 5.
I'm sorry, is it 77? I've got a, thank you.
I don't have a 77 on page 5.
Yep, I've got a funny note in my marking, just one second. So it's down, it should have been 107, sorry.
Page 107?
No, page 5.
Oh.
And then actually starting on, lead in on 108, I guess, is where it starts. And you said, even the blood work that we have, the potassium of 7.7, that's not, that's high, and it has the potential for causing a cardiac arrhythmia at that level. But it would be, if somebody got injected with potassium, it would be a lot higher than that. If they gave them enough to cause cardiac arrest. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
On page 6, line 120, referring to Michelle's liver function tests, you said the liver function tests were quite abnormal, but that in itself wouldn't necessarily be fatal to somebody. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
Then on line 126, you said the prosecutor would have to be very, very good at putting together a circumstantial case, I think. At least that is my view, because there's no toxicology to go with it. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
On page 8, line 159, you said, there's not a smoking gun in here that I see. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
And then on page 14,
Where are you?
line 310. So on page 14, line 310, you said, and so you have this underlying disease process going on, referring to myocarditis, correct?
In that context, I think yes, we're probably still talking about that, yes.
So you have this underlying disease process that's going on, where if I gave you some promethazine or some oxycodone, without that underlying disease process, she'd be fine. But if you have those drugs on top of your myocarditis, you might have a problem. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
And then you testified at the preliminary hearing in this case as well, just over a year ago, correct?
Yes.
And at the preliminary hearing, you shared with us the experience that you had working for Takeda Pharmaceutical. I speak Japanese. I ought to be able to say that better. So, Takeda Pharmaceutical.
I don't. You're one ahead of me.
Right.
Takeda.
Takeda. All right, we'll go with that. And in your experience there, you indicated that you were specifically looking at hypertensive and drugs that affect the heart, affect the blood pressure, and affect the circulatory systems, right?
Yes.
And you indicated that you've worked with all the medications that are at issue in this case, all these drugs at one time or another, correct?
Not at Takeda.
Not at okay, well, yeah, that's all right. Just generally.
Yes.
Okay. And you also indicated at the preliminary hearing that this particular combination of oxycodone, Valium, Phenergan, and Zolpidem, this particular combination is at one point was not particularly unusual in the poorly managed chronic pain patient, correct?
Probably did, yes.
And you indicated that Zolpidem, I think you indicated this today as well, is a hypnotic sleep agent, or Zolpidem is of the category of drugs that is a hypnotic.
Sedative hypnotic,
Okay.
yes.
And fair to say that a common effect of Zolpidem is short-term memory loss?
Yes, it can happen, yes.
And then at the preliminary hearing, back to the QT interval, maybe let's talk a little bit about the QT interval. If somebody has an EKG, then one of the things that's measured on that is what's called the QT interval, correct?
Yes, yes.
And that is measured in milliseconds.
Correct.
And that is something that is indicative of a person's heart condition generally.
Electrically, yes.
Electrically. Okay. And you indicated at the preliminary hearing that when it starts approaching about 450 milliseconds, we're getting the early part of a prolongation. What we refer to as prolongation, well, if it gets over 450 and starts getting closer to 500 milliseconds, in that interval, that's a half second. Then what we have now is a situation where there's an abnormality in the repolarization of the myocardium. And so the electrical conductivity is not sufficient to get the tissue repolarized and polarized the way it's supposed to be. That's what you testified to,
yes.
Correct? You went on to say, and it affects potassium, that there's a whole bunch of biochemistry involved here, but it gets to a certain point and the heart can go into an arrhythmia that's for all intents and purposes irreversible.
Yes, it's called torsade de pointes.
Thank you. And then you went on to say that the important thing here is that it's virtually unsurvivable at that point, with a prolonged QT interval that results in that kind of an arrhythmia. Correct?
Pretty much, yes.
And you indicated that many patients with myocarditis are asymptomatic, correct?
Generally, yes. It depends on the severity.
Fair statement. And then you went on to say, speaking from your own experience now, with the cases that I've seen, there was no indication whatsoever that an individual had very advanced myocarditis.
Yeah, generally, I can expand on that. They're generally, the ones I've seen were not under medical care at the time that they had their event.
And, yeah, and still had an arrhythmia, even though they weren't under medical care, right?
Correct.
You also testify that both oxycodone and promethazine are known to prolong QT intervals, and not necessarily just in toxic levels, right?
Generally speaking, yes. It depends on the severity of the underlying disease.
You indicated sometimes just small amounts of oxycodone or promethazine could prolong the QT interval, correct?
Again, it depends on the severity of the underlying disease as to how little it would take to precipitate an event.
And you indicated at the preliminary hearing that the issue is difficult to stage until autopsy, correct?
Generally, yes.
And then at the preliminary hearing, you were asked, are you aware in the literature or in your own personal experience of any cases that were studied at autopsy that were where the myocarditis was regarded as mild? And you answered, that was the ones that were most often, that was where the twofold increase. It goes all the way up to more than tenfold increase in the very advanced stages. When they were able to start diagnosing it, would be a twofold increase. Is that what you said?
I don't recall the exact context of which we were talking about there, but if that's from the transcript, that's what I said.
Is that accurate, that the early stages of myocarditis would be a twofold increase and then up to tenfold in advance?
In the relative risk.
In the relative risk.
That's,
yes.
that was the part you didn't say.
Right, thank you.
You lost me.
Yeah.
Yeah, the relative risk means when you say there's a twofold increase in relative risk, that means there's a doubling of the risk as the severity of the myocarditis becomes more pronounced.
And that risk is low, right? The starting point before we double it, even with myocarditis, having the risk of having an arrhythmia is a low risk, right?
Any risk is too much from the standpoint of the nature of the arrhythmia that develops. So to characterize it that way might not be totally accurate, but I think it's important to note that that risk as you stage it higher and higher, it's usually done by, as you said, correlating findings at autopsy with what the event was and what was seen and what the extent of the myocarditis. But it's I'm not sure exactly where you would say this risk is still relatively low, except just based on the numbers. You know, a twofold increase might be relatively low to somebody who lives another 20 years. A twofold increase in risk to somebody who dropped dead in the hallway 15 minutes from now might be very high risk. So I'm just trying to put it in some context.
And I appreciate that. Generally not knowing whether somebody was going to drop dead in 2 minutes or whether they were going to live another 20 years, fair to say that the risk of having an arrhythmia is low.
Generally speaking, yes.
And so even when you add on a twofold risk, the risk is still low, right?
Well, relative to a tenfold risk.
Relative to the tenfold risk, yes. Okay. And so when you add Percocet and promethazine, here I am mixing the names up, using the common name for one and the scientific for another. I'll try and be consistent here. So when you add Percocet and Phenergan to the mix of mild myocarditis, it does increase the risk, but the risk is still relatively low compared to the average person, right?
Well, yeah, and again, it depends on the severity of the underlying disease and their predisposition to cardiac arrhythmia.
But it does increase the risk.
It does, yes.
But not such that it leads physicians to refuse to prescribe Percocet and Phenergan together, correct?
And all other things being equal, no, there's not unusual to see them used together.
You talked a little bit about metabolism today. It's fair to say that metabolism is highly variable from person to person. Correct?
Generally, there's not a lot of variability until you specify what you want to look at in terms of a variable. There's some certain constants that are always there.
Yeah, but generally, if you have person A, B, and C, and you measure their general metabolism, there's going to be wide variability from person to person, right?
Depends on what you're looking at, but there can be some variances, and whether or not those variances are what we call clinically significant versus statistically significant is a very important concept.
In relation to metabolization of medications, there's significant variability from person to person.
There can be.
Liver function is a variable that affects metabolization of medications.
It's metabolism.
Metabolism, thank you. I appreciate that. And so liver function is something that affects metabolism.
Generally, yes.
And therefore that would affect the half-life of the medication.
It could. It depends on the metabolic, how that drug is eliminated.
And in this case, oxycodone, promethazine, zolpidem, and diazepam, they're all eliminated through liver processes.
They're metabolized in the liver and eliminated subsequent to that.
At the preliminary hearing, you told me that 8 days would be enough, that you would expect some tolerance to some of the effects of the medications to begin to develop, correct?
Can we get it in context?
Sure.
In terms of
$11.99.
how many doses were taken?
You may.
So referring to, obviously, Michele MacNeill, on line 3, I asked the question, would 8 days be enough for the body to start developing some tolerance to the effects of narcotic medication?
I'm going to object to foundation. This is not referring to Michele MacNeill. This is referring to a person in general.
Do you accept that?
If he's read up, he may be right. Fine, just a person in general.
Sustained. Go ahead.
So a person in general, to ask the question, would 8 days be enough to start developing some tolerance to the effects of medication?
That would depend upon the dose and the frequency of dosing during those 8 days.
And your answer was it would depend upon the individual, but I would expect to see some tolerance to some of the effects begin to develop, correct?
Depending on the context that I was referring to a moment ago was the context around dose and frequency of administration during those 8 days.
So the point is it's certainly possible during an 8-day period to start to develop some tolerance to medications.
It's possible.
You may.
Dr. Dawson, do you recognize this type of a document?
No, it's a what we call a package insert for Zolpidem, looks like the generic Zolpidem.
And does that package insert discuss the half-life of Zolpidem?
Somewhere.
I've got it highlighted in yellow.
Under the pharmacokinetics section, yes.
And in this particular case, the prescription that you reviewed that Michele MacNeill was given for Zolpidem was 10 milligram Zolpidem, correct?
Yes.
And so, according to the package insert, what is the half-life of Zolpidem for the 10 milligram version?
Says the mean Zolpidem tartrate tablets elimination half-life was 2.6, range 1.4 to 4.5, and 2.5, range 1.4 to 3.8 hours for the 5 and 10 milligram tablets.
So there's a range up to 4.5 hours.
For the 5 milligram tablet, it was 3.8 hours for the 10 milligram tablet.
Okay. In addition to the medications that were prescribed by Dr. Thompson in this case, did you also review material in relation to Michele being prescribed medication by Dr. Welch?
What time frame?
Immediately prior to her plastic surgery, March 29th of 2007?
Oh, the antihypertensive medication?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you recognize this document?
Yeah, this will be another package insert, or what they call it. In the pharmaceutical industry, we refer to this as the label. This contains all the prescribing information. Yes.
And it also contains some warnings too, correct?
Yes.
And in relation to lisinopril, fair to say that one of the warnings of potential side effects of lisinopril, hydrochlorothiazide, is cardiac arrhythmias?
And that's what it says.
I have just one moment, Your Honor.
You may.
That's all I have for right now. I'll even remember to put my stuff.
Thank you. Very good. Do you have redirect?
You've been provided a transcript with an interview you had with Doug Whitney. Was Jeff Robinson also party to that phone call?
I believe so, yes.
All right. Will you describe the context of that interview?
The context of the interview was what I do in virtually all circumstances where I'm asked to comment on information that's provided, and that is to provide not an opinion per se, but rather a discussion of where I see certain points that are important that that I would discuss, and I have discussed with the defense attorneys, I've discussed with investigators, I've discussed with prosecutors. I say from my perspective, based on my training and my education, before I could say this, I would need to know this. And that's the general gist of the conversation. You're dealing with, it's a I've been talking too long, a curbside consult in which you're asked about information that you don't have a lot of detail on. And if somebody said, how do I paint my red Ford pickup to make it look blue? Well, I could probably give you some ideas, but here's what you need to do. Here's the steps you need to take to get there. I'm not going to paint it for you, but I can tell you how to get there. it's that context. It's around that kind of open label debate, not really debate, but a discussion, scientific, based upon the information that I bring in to what I can talk to.
So the investigators are floating ideas to you, you're responding to those, is that?
Based on the information I have available and based upon, my background and training.
Okay, if there was some talk about you trying to get around the medical examiner's science, will you explain that?
That's probably a poor choice of words, but it's a discussion that I have with a lot of people when I say, and this has come up before, where you say, or there is, well, the medical examiner report says this, and it's true to the best of their knowledge. And I say, you've got a huge hurdle to overcome to get past that, because that's the medical examiner's report. Those things don't just appear. They come about as a result of a thorough investigation. And if there's some weakness in there someplace, it's very important to address that. But it's not saying, I'm going to give you the roadmap of how you can get around this so it doesn't look bad. I don't do that.
Okay. If you were to do that, what would happen to your professional reputation?
It would go away very, very, very quickly.
Are you familiar, and you have to...
And it's also, just a second, it's also an ethical issue with the Society of Forensic Toxicologists. If I am found to be unethical in that regard, I will lose my membership in that organization, and that's very important.
I'm going to have you turn to page 8 of that transcript.
I don't have it.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you'll look at the top, page 159 and 161, Mr. Spencer read part of your statement to you and asked you to confirm that that was what you said, and you acknowledged that you had said it. Would you read the entirety of your statement?
What's the line number?
159 to 161.
And it just makes the case that much harder. There's not a smoking gun here that I see. There's a lot of it, if I could use the term, of empty casings on the ground, but there's no smoking gun.
What are you talking about there?
There's not, in those 5 drugs, there's not one concentration that would be considered to be lethal.
And
That's the smoking gun. This says,
you testified to today.
yes. And that there is other evidence there that says there is contributory factors from all 5 drugs, but not one that you could point to and say, that's the one that did the damage. That's the fatal dose right there.
Okay. If you'll turn to page 10. We look at the bottom, lines 222 through 226. And this talks about, I believe, the casings that you're referring to, to use the analogy of the smoking gun. Will you read that?
And the Ambien, and while the oxycodone and promethazine and diazepam were all, they were close to therapeutic levels. In other words, you combine these 4 and you've got somebody who's going to be unresponsive in all likelihood because they didn't have a history of using these drugs on a regular basis.
Thank you. And then again on page 12. I'm going to have you look at line 256 to line 263. Will you read that?
Like I say, these and that the 4 were in the tox reports, and that was, well, we've got the nordiazepam as a metabolite of the, let me just clarify this. I don't think I said it exactly this way. Maybe I did, but I don't usually stutter like this. But I'll read it that way. The diazepam or Valium, but we have the oxycodone, the promethazine, and the zolpidem. Zolpidem level was fairly low. If I remember, it was a 0.08. And that may or may not be contributory, and at that level, but the important thing is it would still be enough to combine with the other 3 compounds that they would be likely in this person in a drug-naive state would be rendered, if not unconscious, certainly unresponsive, and Then I said, I believe we had statements from the family to that effect.
The statements of the family referring to?
The effects the drugs were having on Michele.
Or is it?
Not that day, but at times prior. Pardon?
Is it that or that she was drug naive, that she was not taking the drugs regularly before? And if you don't recall, then
I don't recall, but I thought I was thinking, now I'm thinking in terms of maybe comments that may have been made about her condition in the days prior. But it would also apply to the drug naive piece too. That's based on the record we already know.
any inconsistency with things that you've said today
No.
there? When it comes to myocarditis, you discussed that with the investigators?
I believe we did, yes.
Did you diagnose myocarditis in this case?
I didn't diagnose it. It was the basis of a report that I read.
Okay, so you, what report is that?
I believe it was the medical examiner's report that referred to myocarditis.
So you're working off of the assumption in this discussion that myocarditis is at issue?
I deferred that to the medical examiner, yes.
Okay. And as you're discussing potential issues of these drugs in relation to that report from medical examiner, will you look at page 14? Would you read lines 310 through the comma at 313?
And so you have this underlying disease process where if you gave some promethazine or oxycodone, and without that underlying disease process, she'd be fine. But if you have those drugs on top of your myocarditis, you might have a problem. Or if you have way too much of those drugs, that myocarditis is going to make that heart attack or that abnormal cardiac rhythm even more frequently, or at least sooner than you would expect.
Okay, then will you continue with 317 and then to the next page on 320?
The myocarditis is an issue, again, and we really don't know about seeing the slides. Apparently
Have you pause right there. When you say we really don't know without seeing the slides, what are you referring to?
well, there was, at autopsy, they took some tissue and prepared slides
From the heart?
from the heart, and that's how they identify the myocarditis.
Okay, so at this point you're acknowledging I haven't looked at those slides.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any need to look at them.
Okay. Go ahead. Will you continue at line 318 at the bottom of page 14?
Start with the end of the sentence. Is that
You start off where I stopped you at the,
okay?
without seeing
And
the
the slides apparently, if they did tissue samples and that sort of thing of the heart, but obviously it did something because she was able to make that diagnosis, or at least put that in her report, referring to the medical examiner's report.
Okay. Again, deferring to the medical examiner on that issue.
Exactly.
Were there theories that you were discussing with investigators that didn't pan out during this conversation?
You know, I don't recall, other than trying to put some context around and try to get the feeling around the combination. It's the polydrug piece that was of concern for me. I mean, I had no other evidence, nothing to suggest there was anything else that was involved from the pharmacological standpoint. There were issues that came up, such as the hyperkalemia, but the sample of that potassium was analyzed in was +4 hemolysis, which means the red blood cells were all blown up. And that's where I think, my opinion is, that's where most of the hyperkalemia came from, was from the lysis or the damage to those cells, because that's where potassium is inside the cells.
Hyperkalemia is the elevated potassium.
Elevated potassium.
Okay. When we talk about tolerance, you said it was at the preliminary hearing, and again today, you said it was possible that someone could be developing some tolerance for some symptoms within 8 days. Is it probable?
Again, it depends on the dose and the frequency of administration, and to a certain extent, the drug and how it works in the body. when you have repeated doses over a short period of time, some narcotics you can get some tolerance that will develop. In other words, a person starts on 4 Percocet a day and do it for 3 days. Those first couple of days, they're going to be markedly impaired. After a few days, they might become less impaired if they continue on it. But a lot of that depends on the individual. But it's possible, but it's not something, again, it depends on the dose. It's not just something that you say, oh, it's going to happen after so many days. It's going to depend on the dose and the amount that the frequency.
What if they're tapering off the drugs over time?
Well, you would expect to see improvement in their general functioning, and their alertness and awareness of their circumstances if they're off the medication.
How would that affect the development of tolerance?
Well, the tolerance becomes less of an issue as you're coming off the medication because there's less of the drug in your system, and so there's some improvement in terms of that alertness and awareness. If you go off of it completely, then you're over a period of days or weeks, your tolerance goes away, and so if you start back on it, your level of sensitivity is back up to where it was before.
The level of tolerance that could be possibly developed over 8 days, is it such that the, let me rephrase this. We've got certain levels reported in Michele MacNeill's toxicology report. Could someone develop a tolerance within 8 days that would negate the effects of the drugs at those levels?
I think generally I would have to say no, you wouldn't see that but we don't know what the doses were and the frequency of administration. So that's kind of or when the last dose was given. So there's a kind of a void in there that we can't really fill with the right kind of information.
Could I have 1 minute, Your Honor?
You may.
So in spite of any tolerance that may have developed or possibly have developed over those 8 days, what would the effect of that combination of drugs be on a person considering that tolerance, if any?
I think it has been sustained.
Your Honor, I don't believe...
You may make your record. Go ahead.
I don't believe I have asked the question in relation to tolerance. He's added the information on cross-examination that there's a possibility of development of tolerance over those 8 days. I want to know what how that would affect the statement he made earlier about the condition that a person with those concentrations of drugs would be in.
I didn't understand your question in that way. You may ask that question.
Do you want me to state it again, or did
Please.
you?
Please, go ahead.
Earlier, you testified that a person with the drug levels that you see in that toxicology report, alive, and that combination of drugs, would have been severely impaired, possibly even asleep and unarousable. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
On cross-examination, you acknowledge that there could be some development of tolerance depending on some of those issues we've discussed already over those 8 days.
Yes.
Does the addition of that potential for tolerance change your opinion about what's going on in any way?
No.
Okay, that's all I have.
Thank you. Anything further?
One quick question that I
Go ahead.
want to clarify. I'm sorry. May I approach again?
You may.
Don't make a pharmacist out of you yet.
I'm trying. And I apologize for doing that again. I forgot to ask you one question in relation to Zolpidem or Ambien. We talked about the half-life range, but I didn't ask you about the peak plasma level and how long it takes to reach that.
Okay, in a single-dose crossover study, 45 healthy subjects administered 5 and 10 milligrams of zolpidem. The mean peak concentrations were 59 nanograms per mil, they give a range 29 to 113 for the 5 milligrams, and 121, a range of 58 to 272 for the 10 milligram, and occurring in a mean time of 1.6 hours for both. In other words, the Cmax, or the maximum concentration in both doses, occurred approximately average 1.6 hours after the dose.
And it didn't give us the range in that insert, did it? It just gave us the average for the peak plasma level.
Yes.
Okay. And so it's from that peak plasma level that the half-life calculations would then be made, correct?
Not exactly. The half-life is determined by measuring, it's a little more complicated than that, and okay, we'll forgive you. But seriously, the issue has to do with the slope of the line after the peak, and you determine the half-life. There's a formula you use to determine the half-life based upon the blood level goes up, hits a peak, and is decaying or going down. It's the slope of that line. And there's 2 different slopes there, by the way. So.
Yes. Thank you. Mayor.
You may. Anything further? Very good. Do you have questions for this witness? If you do, pass them to the end of the row. Counsel, would you approach
Something wasn't burning up.
Be at the 25th. Just a few questions from the jury. Dr. Dawson, you said the blood sample from which you did your testing was taken 24 hours after the death of Michele. Is this a standard procedure to have blood drawn post-mortem after that length of time?
There's a yes and no answer to that. A lot of the time depends upon a number of circumstances and the jurisdiction that's involved, but typically it's 24 hours. It may be as much as 48. It could even be 72 hours. It just depends upon a number of factors, not the least of which is the scheduling of the time of the autopsy and how quickly it can be done. In the ideal circumstance, you would do it in 24 hours. That's not an abnormally long time.
The second question is, how much Ambien was discovered in Michele's blood? And this is in reference to the toxicology report. Do you remember the concentration of Ambien?
Yeah, the reported value at the autopsy sample was 80 nanograms per milliliter, and that is the postmortem value. It doesn't, as we've said, doesn't directly relate necessarily to what was present at the time of death, but it would be close.
If the circulation of blood is artificial, for example through CPR, would that allow for the continued metabolism of drugs within the liver?
If there was still viable tissue, there's a possibility, but the contribution to that would be minimal in an hour or 2 hours. I mean, it's just when you look at there could be some metabolism that takes place, but it would depend upon the interval from the time of the cessation of circulation and the time of the initiation of the CPR. The longer that interval, the more liver damage occurs and the less likely those cells are still able to do their metabolic work.
And I think you've answered the next question. Would that make a significant difference in the results of a given test? Do you have anything to add to that?
Again, it depends on a number of factors, and the interval is important, number one, and number two, it would depend upon if you have a drug that has a 5-minute half-life, it could be very important, but we don't have any of those here. The half-life is at least 2 or 3 hours, and so it depends on the drug and it depends on that particular circumstance.
Do you have follow-up questions? No. Any from the defense? May Dr. Dawson be released from his trial subpoena, or would you keep him for rebuttal?
We'd like to keep him for now.
All right, I'll order that you remain under your trial subpoena. You may step down today. Thank you very much. You may call your next witness.
Today calls Gypsy Willis.
If you'd like to stand and stretch, go ahead. Thank you. Please be seated. Ms. Willis, if you'll come forward to the clerk's desk. Please raise your right hand and take an oath. Thank you. Please be seated here and respond to counsel's questions.
Will Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
Yes. My name is Gypsy Willis, Gypsy Willis.
Have you gone by any other names?
Yes, I was married for a time. My last name was Jensen, Jensen.
Have you gone by other names as well?
I was going by Gillian MacNeill.
Okay. And you are here on a subpoena?
I am.
And is it true that you're required, pursuant to a plea agreement, to testify in this matters and other matters relating to the defendant?
I think I'm required to testify in all matters.
And in exchange for your testimony, you were given no jail on another case?
That's correct.
And in that case, you were convicted of felonies?
Yes.
And have you been interviewed by law enforcement in relation to this case?
I have.
On how many occasions?
2, I believe. It was in March of 2009 and again in October of 2010.
Did you previously testify at a preliminary hearing in this matter?
I did.
Do you recognize the defendant sitting right here?
I do.
Who is that?
It's Martin MacNeill.
Ask the court to have the record reflect she's identified the defendant.
We'll stipulate your name.
Stipulations accepted. Go ahead.
How do you know the defendant?
We were involved a number of years ago.
In a relationship?
Yes.
When did the two of you meet?
In 2005, November.
And how did you meet?
We met online.
Online chatting?
I had an interest board where I posted things I was interested in. It was instant messenger. He replied to one of the subjects I posted.
Now, you have previously stated a couple different versions of how the two of you met, is that correct?
That is correct.
And are those versions, in fact, true?
What I just said about meeting online is true.
So that's the truth, that you guys met online?
Yes.
What chat username did you use?
I think my email was Phoenix Sheba or something like that.
At which?
At
provider?
hotmail.com. Or, sorry, Yahoo.
PhoenixSheba@yahoo.com?
Yes.
Did you use any other email addresses at this time to communicate?
I think also maybe Lucid Sphinx at Yahoo.
Was it the Lucid Sphinx at Hotmail?
No, I'm sorry. I've recently gone to Hotmail. That's why I keep saying that.
Okay.
It's Yahoo.
So the two of you met in the fall of 2005.
Correct.
And you've told people previously that your relationship evolved.
It did.
Were the two of you communicating in any other way besides online?
By my cell phone. I remember text messaging. I remember getting calls from his work number, possibly on his cell phone as well. It's been a very long time.
I understand.
Sorry.
When did the two of you first meet in person?
In person, it was just before Thanksgiving of 2005.
And how do you remember that?
I had sold my house previously and moved to an apartment that September, I think.
So all of these things are kind of happening at the same time, and that
same
helps
kind of
you?
thing. Yeah.
Okay.
It was shortly after moving to the apartment, North Salt Lake, Bountiful area.
Okay. Did the relationship become sexual?
It did.
And when was that?
I think that was in January of 2006.
And how often were the two of you having sexual relations?
We would see each other about a couple times a month. There were months when we didn't see each other. It was a very casual thing. It was just whenever we had time and it could be arranged.
Okay.
And it was,
Go ahead.
I think we probably had sex half the time. I mean, sometimes it was just lunch.
Did the relationship become more serious in the spring of 2007?
I don't believe so. I had gotten into a nursing program. Well, I'd gotten into a nursing program in 2006, and I had to jump in without a lot of financial preparation. So I was kind of couch surfing, staying with friends at that time, and then in the spring of 2007, Martin mentioned that he had a property that he had a lease on, and that I was welcome to go there if I wanted to. but I was in the middle of a nursing program. It was very, very intensive. So we communicated more, and just being closer to him, we had more visits, but I would not say that it changed other than that.
So in March of 2007, you move into a duplex in Lehigh.
That's correct.
You're closer to the defendant.
Yes.
And who's paying for this duplex?
Martin already had a contract on that property.
So he's paying for the housing there.
Yes.
And did he give you a debit card to use for personal expenses?
Yes.
And you could use that as you needed to?
Correct.
And you were in a nursing program at this time?
I was.
And who was paying for that?
I had financial aid for that.
Did he help assist on that?
I think he helped a little. It was an open-ended loan until I was done with school, basically.
Okay, but
But he was not the prime person paying for it.
he was assisting you with paying for your schooling?
He was assisting me with what I needed until I was out of school.
And when you're living in Lehigh, are the two of you having sex more?
Yes.
Prior to March, were you dating only him?
No.
Around March, were you only dating him?
I was still seeing other people. I was very busy, and so the fact I was seeing him a little more, I didn't see as many other people.
Did you go with him to the Mayo Clinic in Arizona?
I did.
And when was that?
That was in February of 2007.
And what happened when you went to the Mayo Clinic?
He was being tested for some conditions related to his health.
Did you stop in Las Vegas on your way?
We did.
And where did you stop?
We stopped in Las Vegas, and he had me wait at a restaurant while he went to visit his daughter Alexis. And then I got together with friends after and stayed the night there, and then we continued on the next day.
So you stayed the night with friends?
Yes.
Did he tell you where he stayed?
He said he stayed with Alexis.
Did he tell you why?
He said that she had found some things in the car, and she was very upset, and he was just going to go spend the night with her.
Okay, things are a broad term. What kinds of things?
Clothes, makeup, maybe, something like that.
Is it fair to say that previously you've said she saw luggage?
Luggage.
And is it fair to say that you also said that the defendant had told you that Michelle had called and was concerned?
He told me that she had called and just asked him where he was, and he kind of said, what is this about? And then Alexis was very upset, and so he went to stay with her.
And as a result of that, you stayed with friends and he stayed with Alexis?
Yes.
So in March, you're texting and calling more. You moved to Lehigh that he's providing you housing for. He gives you a credit card. He's helping with schooling. This sounds like a
Yeah,
commitment.
he's helping.
Do you remember emailing a potential suitor in March of 2007?
Vaguely, yeah.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may,
And may I be free to approach as needed?
please.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 39. Will you
Thank
look
you.
at that?
Okay.
You recognize that?
I do.
What is it?
It is a letter that I wrote in response to a guy that was asking me on a date.
Okay. And in that letter, you said, "A very good and best friend of mine has recently become much more than that."
That's correct.
What was the date of this email?
March 6th
Of what year?
I'm sorry, 2007.
Okay. So on March 6th of 2007, you emailed another suitor and said, "A good and best friend has become much more than that. And because of that, it would be inappropriate for the two of you to meet."
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked State's Exhibit 40. Will you look at that? Let me ask you, do you recognize that?
I do.
And what is that?
This was a letter in response to the letter he wrote me after the one I sent him.
What we might call a follow-up email.
Yes, a follow-up email.
And in this, or what date was this one written on?
This was on Tuesday, the 13th of March, 2007.
So a week later.
Yes.
And you said, and in response to your question, how it happened, I met him online a year and a half ago. We've always been great together. And then you went on to say, and just recently, his reasoning and views changed, and we are together now. Is that fair to say?
That's what I wrote.
Okay. Move to offer these two exhibits, Your Honor.
I'll object, Your Honor. I think it's hearsay, and she's testified about the content of them. That's appropriate.
What's your response to that?
My response is these are documentation of an increase in their relationship.
Well, the objections here say they're out-of-court statements of this witness offered for their truth. Is there an exception?
I would say that they fall under the recorded recollection.
I don't know that she ever expressed she had no recollection. I'll reserve on it. Will you just note that I've reserved on 39 and 40? Thank you.
At this time, and I'm talking March and April of 2007.
Okay.
What was the phone number you had at this time?
801.
Okay, and you said that you had communicated with the defendant in two different ways. One was a cell phone and one was a work phone. Do you remember those numbers?
I don't remember them from memory, no.
Could I ask you if you're familiar with a couple numbers?
Yes.
One is 319.
That was a cell number.
Okay. The other is 7.
I believe that was the work number.
While you're marking those, I think I'd just like to rule on 39 and 40. Sustained as to, I think, the hearsay, but I think she testified that the relationship hadn't changed at all in the spring. Their prior inconsistent statements, extrinsic evidence of them is admissible so long as she is given an opportunity to examine and explain or deny the statement. The adverse party is given an opportunity to see the documents and examine as well. I'll receive them. You may.
Ms. Willis, I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibits 41 and 42. And before doing this, I believe we have a stipulation as to phone records, so I've moved to offer them.
Any objection?
No objection.
States Exhibits 41 and 42 are received.
I'm just going to explain these briefly to you,
Okay.
okay? This is the defendant's telephone records for outgoing calls from the Utah State Developmental Center phone.
Okay.
This is the date and time. This is the number that's being called.
Okay.
What number on the exhibit?
And that's number 41.
Okay.
Number 42 is the phone records for the defendant's cellular phone. It has phone calls in this section, and I've tabbed it here. This is where text messages begin.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to run through a little exercise with you using these records. I want to go to March 29th. You look at March 29th in the Utah State Developmental Center records.
Okay.
It appears that the defendant called you one time. Is that correct?
Let's see, 29th. Yes.
And then on April 1st, there were no calls from this number to you.
Just a moment. March 30th. Correct.
And then April 2nd, there were 3 calls to you.
Okay.
And this is your phone number, 671-578. April 3rd, there were no calls, as I read that.
Okay.
April 4th, I see 2 calls.
Yes.
April 5th, I see 1 call.
I don't think I see April 5th.
Okay, you
But-
can tell me if you don't see it.
I don't believe I see April 5th.
And then April 6th, I see 6 phone calls.
I believe you're right.
April 8th, I see 1 call.
Yes.
April 9th, I see 3 calls.
9th. Sorry, just a moment. I think I see 1,
Okay.
but no, I think you're right. I think I see 3.
Okay, April 10th, I see 1 call.
Sorry, there are a lot of numbers here.
There are.
Okay.
April 11th, I see 2 calls in the morning.
11th. And then, just a moment. Okay, that's correct.
Okay, and what times are the calls at April 11th on?
I see one at 6:48 in the morning and one at 9:26 in the PM.
Are you familiar with what happened on April 11th of 2007?
A little, yeah.
Okay, what happened on that date?
I understand that Martin's wife was found collapsed. He tried to resuscitate her. She was taken to the hospital, coded, and then passed away.
April 13th, I see 1 call.
Yes,
What time was that at?
13th, 10:20 PM.
So April 13th, which I understand to be a Friday, the defendant called you at 10:20 PM from the developmental center phone. Is that fair to say?
I believe so.
Okay, let's go to the other exhibit if you would with me. And admittedly, this is going to be a lot more accounting. But would you turn to that text section and go to March 29th?
Okay.
I'm going to go back. Apparently, I missed this. On the U.S. Developmental Center, on April 11th, you said 2 times that the defendant called you. Would you repeat those?
Just a moment. April 11th. I see a call at 6:48 AM, and I see one at 9:26 PM on April 11th.
Did I approach?
Yes.
Are you familiar with military time?
Yes.
What does that appear to say?
Oh, I'm sorry. 9:26 AM.
Okay.
I apologize.
So that was 9:26 a.m. Okay, are we to the text on March 29th?
29th, okay.
Fair to say that you and the defendant text messaged approximately 38 times that day?
Approximately.
There's a lot of text.
There's a lot of text.
April 1st, 6 texts between the two of you?
I'm sorry, you said April 1st?
Yes.
Yes.
April 2nd, 10 texts?
Approximately.
April 3rd, around 24 texts?
I would say approximately so.
April 4th, approximately 17 texts?
April 4th?
Correct.
Maybe let's start another page, just a moment, sorry. Just trying to get a general idea. Oh, okay, approximately.
Approximately 17. And 2 of these texts came after 10:45 p.m., correct?
Yes,
And on the morning of April 5th, there were 16 text messages between the two of you between midnight and 10 a.m. on April 5th.
okay.
Is that what it looks like?
Do you want me to count them?
Does it look like a lot of text between that time period?
Yeah, looks like a good handful or two.
Okay. I want to go to April 11th of 2007.
Okay.
Approximately 30 texts.
Okay, are you multiplying by 2 each one of these entries?
No, total between the two of you.
Okay, well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
I approach.
Yes.
Okay. So you see 15 texts there? April 12th. How many do you see there?
You're going to make me count all of these. I see 12.
Okay, do you see a different delineation for certain kinds of text on that time, at that time?
I see like incoming,
Okay,
incoming, or maybe the city it was sent from or something like that.
okay. Could I see that real quick?
Yes.
Do you see what this says right here?
Picture.
And so what does that mean?
I guess that's a picture.
Okay, so there were picture texts that you sent to the defendant on April 12th.
I guess.
Do you recall those?
I don't. It's been a very long time.
Let's go to April 14th.
Just a moment. Okay.
How many texts are on April 14th?
Are you saying only from my number, or am I adding up all of them of that
Just
day?
between
Because,
you and the defendant.
oh,
I apologize.
I'm sorry. Okay, 14th. Let's see. Oh. In the neighborhood of like 22, I think. I may have missed one. I kept counting after a while.
Okay, so there's
Sorry.
10 or so texts.
Yes.
Texts. on the day of April 14th. Are you familiar with what was happening on April 14th?
I believe that was the day of his wife's funeral.
And did you attend that funeral?
I did.
Do you remember what time that funeral went on from?
I think it was in the neighborhood of like 10 or 11 noon. I don't remember. It seemed like it was in the later morning.
Okay. And you sent him 4 texts between 9 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. on April 14th.
Sorry, this is an important day. I'm trying to get my information correct. I see 2 incoming texts in the hour of 9, and then 2 incoming texts in the hour of 12.
What times on the 12?
12:13, 12:21.
Okay, and those were from your phone? The
Yes.
671 number, okay. And is it fair to say that during the months of March and April, that the two of you would communicate by voice on the developmental center phone, and if it was from his cell phone, that it would be by text only?
Probably, yeah.
And why would that be the case?
Why would that be the case?
Why would he not call you from his cell phone?
You know, this was a very informal, discreet thing. We were not interested in other people knowing.
Okay.
I think he was trying to keep it quiet. I respected that.
But on April 14th, the day of Michelle's funeral, he in fact called you from his cell phone for the first time, right? In a couple of months.
Sorry, I think I need to flip my papers around here. My recollection, it's been a very long time.
You can look. It's easy to find.
Okay. I'm not sure if this shows incoming or outgoing, but I do see a number that was dialed. My number dialed.
Your number was dialed from his phone. Okay. I can take those from you.
Okay. That would come as a surprise. That was not my favorite subject.
You attended the funeral, you said?
I did.
Did you speak to the defendant at the funeral?
I spoke to him briefly after and just said, I hope you're all right, and if there's anything I can do, please let me know.
So this was like the luncheon thing?
I didn't go to the luncheon. It was immediately
It was
after.
immediately after you approached him and
And said-
offered condolences?
Yes. And then left.
I want to go to some of the conversations that you had with the defendant or overheard prior to the day of Michelle's death. Do you remember making a statement about high blood pressure?
Do I remember making a statement about high blood pressure?
About hearing the defendant say something about high blood pressure?
Yeah, well, yes.
Could you tell us that?
I overheard a conversation where I think Michelle had called him, and she had stopped and gotten her blood pressure checked, and it was quite high, and he said, you've got to get that under control if you're going to have this surgery.
Okay. Did the defendant tell you about the day that Michelle passed away?
A little, yeah.
And what did he tell you?
He told me that there was a health fair going on at his developmental center. He told me that he had picked up his youngest from school and had gotten to the house and found Michelle in the bathtub.
Did he tell you how she was dressed?
He did. I think she was. I don't remember when. Just I didn't chase him for details, but I believe she was partially dressed.
Did he tell you that he thought Michelle had a low pain threshold?
Yes.
Did he tell you about calling Alexis that same morning concerned about Michelle?
Yes.
What did he tell you regarding that?
Just that she wasn't, I think Michelle wasn't listening to what he was saying, or she was trying to do too much activity, just that she was restless. My recollection is that he wanted her to call and just check to make sure that she was resting.
I want to move on to the next week. Do you remember going to the temple to meet Rachel?
I remember going to meet Rachel. The exact dates escape me, I'm sorry.
Okay. And what were you supposed to do when you went to the temple?
I was supposed to walk up and introduce myself and maybe strike up a small conversation and leave.
Okay.
It's just an introduction.
Did you dress like you were going to be attending the temple?
I dressed in a dress. It was appropriate for the circumstance.
And when you came up, what did the defendant say?
He just said hello and, what was your name?
He asked you what
Something
your name
like that.
was. And what did you say?
I told him my name was Jillian. We'd met before, I believe.
And did you say how the two of you had met?
I don't remember.
And then what did he do?
He introduced me to Rachel.
Did he leave while you were talking with Rachel?
I don't think so. They were sitting on a bench outside. I don't think he left.
Did he ask you for your name a second time?
I don't recall.
I don't recall. Did he ask you for your phone number?
I don't really remember that either.
Any reason he wouldn't know your phone number at this point?
No, it was more of an introduction to his family.
Okay. So he staged and directed this encounter.
I don't understand the terminology there, but he wanted me to meet his family on the best possible terms. He felt very badly that they might think.
I'll just stop you there.
Sorry. Okay.
I'm not asking for what he thought at this point. Do you remember speaking with Doug Whitney on April 2nd of 2009?
I thought when I spoke to Whitney, it was
Oh, I apologize.
March.
You're correct, March 3rd of 2009.
Okay.
That's when he wrote the report.
Yes.
Okay. In this transcript, DW stands for Doug Whitney and GW stands for you.
Yes.
Will you read this highlighted portion?
Doug Whitney is saying, okay, so he staged and directed it, and I agreed, yeah.
Okay, so on that occasion, you agreed that the defendant had staged and directed the temple visit.
It seems, I didn't understand the import, but
Okay.
I agreed to what he was saying. I mean,
So the two of you had talked about what was going to happen before it took place.
briefly, yeah.
And you had talked about part of this was to bring you into the home as the nanny.
My recollection at this point is that it was to meet the family on better, to have an introduction.
Soon after this, you attended a nanny interview, correct?
Yes.
Who conducted that interview?
It was at the MacNeill house. I guess Martin conducted it. The children were there. I think everyone was there except Alexis, perhaps.
Okay, and who interviewed you?
I think Martin was asking me questions, and I just kind of introduced myself and told them a little bit about my life and background.
Do you remember who was Damien there?
Yes.
Was Eileen his girlfriend there?
Yes, I believe so.
Was Vanessa there?
Yes.
Was there any question you were going to be hired as the nanny?
I don't believe that Martin would have had me come and help if his children had objected strongly to me.
That's speculation. I'm going
What are you asking
move
me?
to strike that answer, Your Honor.
I think it was responsive. You said, was there any question? And she thought there was. The answer will stay.
Okay.
When you're ready to break at a convenient time.
Could we approach, Your Honor?
Yeah,
on that?
go ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a good time to break. We've kept you just a few minutes longer. I'm sorry for that. We'll now recess for the weekend. Remember, you're not to form or express any opinion about the case until it's finally submitted to you. Don't discuss the subject, any subject of the trial with anyone amongst yourselves, with family members or friends you may see over the weekend. Strictly avoid news, television, radio, internet, media coverage of the trial, and then do no research on your own using computers, electronic devices, or something else. We'll begin Tuesday morning here in this courtroom again, 8:30. Thank you. Thank you. Is there anything further today?
Don't believe so, Your Honor. We've talked.
Okay. We'll begin Tuesday morning at 8:30. Again, thank you for your careful work today. Court's in recess.